In 1937, Congress passed a law that would profoundly affect America's wildlife. Not many people realize it, but with every purchase of a hunting rifle, a shotgun, a target pistol, ammunition, or archery equipment, a portion of that money directly benefits America's wildlife, both game and non-game species alike. A law passed back in 1937, the Federal Aid in Wildlife Restoration Act, usually known as Pittman-Robertson after the two legislators who sponsored it, directed that a manufacturer's tax on all sporting arms and ammunition, which amounts to millions of dollars each year, be turned over to the states and territories for the sole purpose of wildlife conservation. Since 1937, as a result of that law, more than $2 billion has gone into wildlife research and restoration programs for land acquisition, for habitat improvement, and also for hunter education programs. Today, many of our wildlife species are now more abundant and in better shape than at any time during the past 100 years. As we look to the future, perhaps the most encouraging and enduring contribution of Pittman-Robertson may well be that the science and practice of wildlife management is now well established across America. With the coming of spring to the dense pine forests of central Maine, the state's black bear trapping program swings into high gear. From May through July, teams of wildlife biologists will run daily checks along 50 miles of trap line. Bears have a trait very convenient for trappers. They usually walk in their old footprints. Meat scraps are used to bring them to a spot, and then a snare is set around a fresh bear track. The introduction of fast-acting tranquilizing drugs during the 1960s revolutionized wildlife research. Vital measurements can now be made on wild animals with minimum risk to the researcher or to the animal. Since 1975, when Pittman-Robertson funding for a bear study began in Maine, over 700 bears have been trapped, measured, and released. Many bears have become veterans of the capture, and each year add more valuable data to their individual medical and developmental histories. It wasn't all that long ago that folks in Maine would have scoffed at the idea of spending time and money learning about bears. Even into the late 1950s, a bounty was paid on black bear. And between 1946 and 1957, over 10,000 were killed to collect it. In Maine, as most everywhere else in the country, attitudes and policy about bears were based largely on fear and ignorance. Since then, things have changed. Black bears, grizzlies, and polar bears as well are now protected from indiscriminate killing in every state, and Maine is the site of one of the largest black bear studies in the country. Radio transmitting collars were another revolutionary tool for the wildlife biologist. The radio collars permit remote monitoring of animal movement and location, and even its activity and respiration rates. This sow bear will again be visited by the wildlife biologists. From January through March, the biologists follow the radio signals to visit and examine each of their hibernating female bears. Black bears often make their winter dens beneath fallen trees. Here, the cubs will be born in the dead of winter. Hibernation doesn't mean that the bear is fast asleep. They've been known to roar out at the crack of a twig. It takes a special confidence in one's understanding of bear behavior, and no small amount of courage to crawl into a bear den. Once the sow has been immobilized with a tranquilizer, her active cubs will see the full light of day for the first time. As all newborns, they must be kept warm. The 200-pound sow is also brought out to have her file updated. In order to make responsible decisions about our environment, such as logging, development, hunting seasons, or simply access to wilderness areas, a scientific understanding about wildlife and its needs is essential. This understanding emerges slowly over time and must be based on hard data, facts, and these must be acquired piece by tiny piece from countless measurements and observations in the field and in the laboratory. There is so much that needs to be understood. This study in Maine is trying to determine the factors influencing the survival rate of black bear cubs. What is the correlation between birth weight and survival? What effect do litter size, mother's weight, weather, habitat conditions have on cub survival? Finding answers to some of these questions will help wildlife managers predict population trends and thus be better equipped to make timely management decisions. After all the measurements and samples are taken, the mother is put back into the den in the same position as she had been found. The cubs are sprayed with a cedar scent to mask human odor and placed on the mother. Black bear cubs stay with their mothers for around 16 months, hibernating with her through the second winter. They will once again be visited next January to see how they're coming along and have their medical records updated. The Black Bear Research Project in Maine is one of 22 bear studies around the country. With each year, our knowledge and understanding about black bear increases, and all this effort for an animal that not so long ago was all but officially willed to extinction in many states. Wildlife extinction was the least of the worries the early settlers to this continent had. The newcomers found an abundance of wildlife species, such as wild turkey and deer, and eagerly sought them for food. But those days of abundance soon passed, and with time, game animals became harder and harder to find. It wasn't merely hunting for food and clothing that caused wildlife to become scarce, but rather what was happening to the land. Wood was needed for homes and barns, and open space for farms and towns. Down came the forest. Throughout New England and the Atlantic states, the wooded valleys were cleared and fenced, the mountains stripped of trees, and the river bottoms plowed and planted. The loss of habitat was devastating to woodland wildlife such as the wild turkey. Exploitive hunting for money, without regard to season or sex of the animal, also took a heavy toll. Deer skins were eagerly sought in Europe for clothes and shoes, and deer meat and waterfowl were sold in the butcher shops. By the late 1800s, early conservationists, many of them sportsmen, realizing that wildlife was rapidly disappearing, pressured states to regulate hunting and ban it completely on some species. By the 1920s, the wild turkey was to be found only in small pockets in isolated areas. From that low to today's abundance of turkey again traces basic changes in America. From the mid-1920s on, thousands of small farms were abandoned as unprofitable. Once bare mountain pastures and formerly plowed fields began to return to wooded land. Today, there are over 3 million wild turkeys, a 10-fold increase in less than 50 years. 3 factors came together to make this amazingly successful restoration possible. First, the regrowth of the forests. Eastern wild turkeys thrive in mature hardwoods that have a closed canopy, patches of open areas, and lots of acorn-producing oaks. Second, concern and cooperation of people. In Missouri, where most of the land is privately held, the close cooperation of the landowner was essential for turkey restoration to work. Landowners could have turkeys released on their farms if they agreed to protect the birds and maintain an area as wild turkey habitat. Even seeds were given free to farmers who agreed to plant them in plots reserved exclusively for wildlife. Advice and financial assistance were provided by the state on how to improve their timber stands for turkey. Third, the ability after years of experimentation to safely trap large numbers of wild turkeys with cannon nets. The trap site is baited with corn. In a nearby blind, the men wait patiently. For years, attempts were made to raise game farm turkeys for release in the wild in the hope that new populations would result. But it never really worked. The game farm birds couldn't adapt to making it on their own. Only after the cannon capture net had been perfected, together with the availability of suitable forest habitat and public support, were large-scale restoration programs possible. In Missouri, wild turkey restoration has been completed. The numbers tell the tale. In 1960, less than 100 birds could be safely taken statewide during hunting season. In 1986, more than 32,000 were taken during the 2-week spring season, and the population continues to expand. Missouri now captures wild turkeys for trade with other states. Within 12 hours of capture, these birds will be released in Kentucky. In early spring, in exchange for the turkeys, 20 river otters that Kentucky had obtained from Louisiana arrived to an eager crowd. The trade was now complete. River otters were once abundant in Missouri, but unregulated fur trapping wiped them out many years ago. The motive behind this restoration program is that otter were once here in Missouri's rivers and streams, and that they belonged here again for the enjoyment of all Missouri citizens. This is the result of too many deer and too little food. The sheared line is the uppermost limit that deer can stretch for food. Everything else that can be eaten has been. There is a persistent popular belief that the best policy towards wildlife is to leave it completely alone. And that was tried, but with tragic results. It was discovered that some species, like deer, in the absence of predators, will continue to reproduce, multiplying far beyond the amount of food available to them, often resulting in malnutrition and starvation. Sapelo, one of the small barrier islands off the coast of Georgia, is good white-tailed deer habitat. It has a generous food base, warm weather year-round, but no natural predators. The deer thrive here and could, unless checked, easily double their number every 2 years, eventually destroying the plants which make up the deer's food base. While Sapelo is certainly not typical of mainland habitat for whitetails, it has similar management problems. To help control the white-tailed deer population on Sapelo, which is a state wildlife management area with strictly limited access, special hunts are authorized. For this long fall weekend, only a young person with a parent will be permitted to hunt. Sport hunting, where a man assumes the role of predator, is the most effective deer management tool. By setting the length of the season, the bag limit, the sex and age of deer that can be taken, wildlife managers can adjust and stabilize the population so that the deer herd will be healthy. In Georgia, as in other states, the health of white-tailed deer populations is systematically monitored on a statewide basis. At check stations, a variety of information about the animal is recorded: age, weight, sex, body condition. Blood and tissue samples may be taken. All this information from across the state and throughout the hunting season flows to a central location where it is entered into a computer. The information will be used to establish a profile of the age and sex distribution of the different Georgia white-tailed deer populations. Once a population profile is known, future hunting seasons and bag limits can be carefully regulated to ensure that deer populations are healthy and remain within the carrying capacity of their habitat. Another source of valuable information available to wildlife managers in the Southeast are the deer herd health checks conducted by the Southeastern Cooperative Wildlife Disease Study Unit, funded in large part by Pittman Robertson. The unit has developed a sampling technique which has proven to be an accurate indicator of the health of a deer herd. If deer aren't able to eat enough nutritious food, the result is a weakened physical condition and lower resistance to parasites. By counting the number of parasites in the stomach, the condition of a deer's habitat can be rated. Very few parasites means that the deer's habitat is adequate for the population. However, the presence of many parasites indicates that the carrying capacity of its habitat had been exceeded, and steps should be taken to balance the number of deer with the habitat. For over 30 years, the diseases and parasites of the white-tailed deer and other wildlife species have been studied by the unit. Their research has pointed the way to early detection of potential problems and to better wildlife management practices. The restoration of the white-tailed deer in America is an unparalleled wildlife management success story. From a low of 300,000 at the turn of the century, we now have over 15 million white-tailed deer. The whitetail brings enjoyment and recreation to millions. For many, it is the very symbol of America's wildlife. One element that is critical in the lives of many species, that is shrinking faster than it is being restored, are wetlands. This rapidly disappearing habitat is rich with an amazing variety of wildlife. The wood duck, one of the most beautiful wetland residents, was almost exterminated by the early 1900s. The relentless draining of swamps and ponds, the clearing of timbered bottomlands, the unrestricted hunting had all taken their toll. After the turn of the century, alarmed sportsmen and other conservationists petitioned Congress that the wood duck should be given complete protection, and it was in 1918. During the next 25 years, the population recovered enough so that by 1941, a very limited regulated hunt was again permitted. As the wood duck increased, biologists discovered another problem. In places there were not enough nesting sites. The continued conversion of woodland to farms had reduced the available tree cavities preferred by the wood duck. During the early 1940s, a nesting box was developed that was quickly accepted by the wood duck. Over the next years, thousands of nesting boxes were erected, which helped the wood duck population increase. Frank Belrose, wildlife biologist with the Illinois Natural History Survey, has been studying wood ducks since the late 1930s. and was very involved with the development of the nesting boxes. Each spring he surveys for returning birds, occupancy rates, clutch sizes, and many other factors that he has tracked for over 49 years. Wildlife research attempts to understand a complex, dynamic process. Nothing is ever static in nature. Populations rise and fall, there are droughts and pollution, abundance of food or scarcity, all affecting wildlife behavior and welfare. The wildlife researcher tries to put some order and understanding into this changing world. The results of these studies will help take some of the guesswork out of managing something as elusive as migratory waterfowl. Here along the Mississippi River, near Nauvoo, Illinois, is the densest concentration of wood duck nesting boxes in America. This long-term research project is studying wood duck nesting and social behavior. The wood ducks using the boxes are fitted with identifying leg bands. Records on each bird are kept, noting sex, age, weight, when and where they were banded. If the bird should be taken by a hunter, the band will be sent in to complete the record. It was through tracking the movements of banded birds that early biologists discovered that there were flyways and corridors that waterfowl use when migrating. This knowledge led to the establishment of refuges along these flyways to provide habitat during their migrations. The eggs hatch after a month of incubation. The ducklings remain in the nest about 24 hours before the hen calls her brood out. The return of the wood duck is a success story that ranks with the wild turkey and the white-tailed deer. The protected status gave the severely reduced species a chance to build up its numbers. The nest boxes fulfilled an urgent need, and also the wood duck, with time, became more adaptable to the activities of man. Even the return of the beaver helped. The beaver had almost been eliminated by unrestricted fur trapping, but it responded well to restoration efforts. Today, the beaver has returned to much of its former range, building dams, creating ponds in the midst of trees, whose cavities the wood duck now use for nesting and the water close by for brood rearing. Conservation of suitable wildlife habitat, be it wetlands, forest, or grasslands, is the base on which all wildlife management efforts must be built. The abundance or scarcity of a wildlife species is directly linked to the condition and extent of its habitat. From late winter through early spring, the male prairie chickens gather at dawn on their traditional booming grounds to perform the rituals of courtship and squabble about their territories. In central Wisconsin, 11,000 acres of grassland spread in small parcels around Portage County are being specifically managed by the state for the welfare of prairie chicken. Prairie chickens require an uneven patchwork of short and tall grasses, short for display during breeding and tall for cover while nesting. The chickens also need open vistas and nearby grain sources. To meet these needs, all of the parcels of land on the Buena Vista management area are on a 5-year disturbance cycle. Disturbance might entail plowing the sod under, knocking down the brush, or letting cattle graze. These activities rotate through the management area so that there is a constant unevenness of growth. On a regular schedule, the grasslands are burned, eliminating the dead materials and stimulating new grasses to grow. Burning, which is critical for renewal of grasslands, was historically a natural event caused by lightning strikes. Without the fire and ground disturbance, this land would rapidly turn to brush and forest, squeezing out the grasslands, and with them, the prairie chicken. In April, the hens begin to incubate their eggs. During this period, biologists conduct their annual nesting survey. The cable dragged across the grassland will flush the hen, revealing the location of her nest. The cable rides too high over the ground to harm the eggs. The prairie chicken in central Wisconsin is doing well. Its grassland habitat, donated by private sources, will be preserved for the future. The state, with Pittman-Robertson funds, is committed to actively manage the land. It is not planned nor anticipated that this Portage County population will ever be large enough for a regular hunting season. All this effort has no other motive than that people feel strongly that the prairie chicken belongs in central Wisconsin. The graceful and swift pronghorn antelope, a species native only to North America, once roamed across our vast central plains in numbers that may have exceeded 30 million. But that era quickly drew to an end as the pioneers pushed westward, plowing up the grass and fencing the open prairies. During this time, the nation displayed an appetite for wildlife that was almost insatiable, and the market hunter obliged. The combination of lost range and unrestrained hunting almost wiped out what once seemed an inexhaustible supply of animals. By the 1920s, only 13,000 pronghorn from the original millions still existed. The downward trend bottomed out during the Great Depression and the Dust Bowl years. As the drought ended, marginal farms which had been abandoned began their slow return to prairie. During the late 1930s and early 1940s, the remnant pronghorn populations were surveyed, and research into their food and habitat requirements was conducted. Pittman-Robertson funds were used to trap antelope from the larger herds and release them on their former range. Today, the pronghorn is at its highest level since 1870, with more than 1 million animals. The population continues to grow, and most of the transplanting programs have been completed. While there are many thousands of square miles of federal and state lands that are actively managed for wildlife, far more, which is potentially useful to wildlife, is under private ownership. In Texas, where there are a few public lands, the state works closely with the rancher and farmer to advise on how they may improve their land for wildlife. There are usually steps that the landowner can voluntarily take to benefit the wildlife on his place.
What do you think we'll do about these fences?
Royce, these net wire fences that are left over from the sheep ranching days are very restrictive to antelope movement. The antelope won't jump the fence as a deer would. They have to go under it. What we need to do is loosen this bottom level of the wire and fold it up so there's a 16-inch gap here. And we need to do that for about a 100-yard stretch, about every half mile. That'll give the antelope free range over the ranch. When you pull your cattle out of the pasture, you need to make sure that the pumps are still working and that the water is available for the antelope.
Guess it'll benefit the rest of my wildlife too?
Yeah, the deer will come down and use it, and the quail and other non-game birds.
Well, I'll leave it on then.
Okay.
Will the antelope compete with my cattle?
No, they won't, Royce. The cattle are grazers, and they'll take your grass. The antelope are primarily four-beaters, and they'll take these broad-leafed green weeds. When times get hard, the antelope will take the prickly pear and the other browse species.
Well, that's good, and they ought to be good to have around.
They'll do good here.
Today on western ranges from Texas to Montana, pronghorn antelope are grazing side by side with beef cattle, just as they did with buffalo before the arrival of the white man. Testimony to the pronghorn's adaptability and to the science of wildlife management. The American pronghorn is a beautiful example of how man and wildlife can coexist compatibly. The American elk could once be found from New England to the Pacific coast. As with so many other wildlife species, habitat loss and exploitation brought the number of elk, once estimated at 10 million, down to 50,000 by the beginning of this century. While elk is another restoration success story, primarily through transplanting to its former range, it frequently finds itself in conflict with the rancher and the forester. In Oregon, the timber industry is a big, important business that can heavily impact on forest wildlife. For the elk, logging may mean substantial disruption of its habitat. Not only noise, roads, and pollution, but the hillsides stripped of trees can erode, silting streams and bottomlands. For the forester, elk becomes an expensive nuisance when they feed on the newly planted Douglas fir seedlings. Today, a successful experiment by Oregon State wildlife biologists is demonstrating that there may be a simple solution to both problems. After logging, controlled burning prepares the land for new growth. Logging waste is consumed, and the ash created by the fire helps fertilize the soil. After the burn, the land is planted with young Douglas fir seedlings, and also grasses and clover for elk, a new approach to wildlife habitat improvement and forest management. For the forester, grass and young trees have always been considered a bad combination. It was feared that the grass would choke off the moisture, soil nutrients, and sunlight from the young seedlings. Oregon's wildlife biologists demonstrated that grass would not conflict with tree growth. Through Pittman-Robertson funds, a number of clear cuts in Oregon are being seeded and fertilized each year. The results have been positive for both the forester and the elk. For the forester, his young tree seedlings are bypassed by the elk, now that the more preferred grass is available. And also the grass is holding the topsoil and slowing erosion. For the elk, the grass has meant better nutrition and healthier herds. The number of elk is rapidly increasing. On the open ranges in eastern Oregon, the conflict is between cattle and elk. Both are grazers competing for the same limited quantity of grass. Cattlemen have always objected to elk on their pastures. On Bridge Creek Flats, a 13,000-acre wildlife management area purchased with Pittman-Robertson funds, a demonstration project is showing that both cattle and elk can benefit from the same pastures. The premise of the experiment was quite simple. Since both warm and cool season grasses grow in the same pastures, why not move the cattle off part of the range during the late summer and allow the cool season grasses to develop for the elk to use during the winter? It worked. Bridge Creek Flats now boasts the nation's highest overwintering population of elk that is not artificially fed. In the spring, when the elk depart for their summer range high in the mountains, the cattle will be back to feed on these same pastures. Today, the elk is doing well in the West. The population has increased tenfold to over 500,000, and in many areas has reached the optimum number for a stable, healthy population. Alan Anderson, a Colorado wildlife biologist, will be devoting 15 years of his professional life to an animal that he has rarely seen in its natural state. For hours each week, he flies and listens to the faint radio beeps echoing up from the rugged canyons west of Montrose, Colorado. Radio signals that emanate from special transmitting collars placed on 30 different mountain lions. By tracking and recording their movements, he hopes to understand their social interactions and their territorial needs. Anderson's research project will attempt to trap and radio collar every resident lion within a 700 square mile study area. Specially trained dogs are used to track the cats. This lion has been stalking a mule deer.
Come here.
Capturing lions to radio collar is extremely arduous and time-consuming work. As many as 6 weeks of daily searching have gone by between captures. While the lion could easily outrun the dogs, it usually prefers to climb into a tree. This young lion, which somehow managed to get wet during the chase, will have its collar replaced as it grows older and larger. Measurements and observations on every lion are recorded and, with recapture, updated. The effects of the tranquilizer will soon be gone, and this young lion's weekly and often daily movements will be monitored. Lions are believed to have an intricate and very ordered social structure. Data suggest that the territorial requirements of the males are the determining factor for population levels, but no one knows for sure. As with the black bear, attitudes about the mountain lion are changing. Once a bountied animal, it is now highly regarded as a big game species. With that new status comes concern on how to maintain healthy and stable mountain lion populations. Anderson's long-term research will provide insight on the ecology of the lion population and its complex social structure. In this rugged, unforgiving landscape lives one of the most highly esteemed wildlife species in North America, the desert bighorn sheep. A century ago, the desert bighorn could be found on mountain ridges and in desert canyons throughout the Southwest. Like other species, it too was a victim of indiscriminate killing and loss of its habitat to livestock. Today, it occupies only a small fraction of its former range. But successful efforts by state and private organizations are slowly but surely returning the desert bighorn to its historic range. Here in the Kofa Mountains of southwestern Arizona, a cooperative effort between federal, state, and the Arizona Desert Bighorn Sheep Society is underway to capture at least 40 sheep from their rocky ledges and transport them for release 100 miles further north. These successful capture techniques were developed and refined with Pittman-Robertson funds. Over the past few years, more than 1,500 sheep have been captured and released in new areas. The dart was loaded with a powerful muscle relaxant. The sheep remains conscious but immobile during transport. Everything is done as quickly as possible to minimize any chance of overstressing the animal.
Yeah, because I'm going to drop this thing as soon as I'm ready. Go. Okay. Ready? Yep.
At base camp, the effects of the drug are quickly reversed by an antidote injection. Blood samples drawn, measurements taken, antibiotic shots given, and for some, a radio collar attached. Sheep are particularly vulnerable to a host of parasites and diseases, and the veterinarian examines each sheep for its health. After 5 days in the desert, 40 healthy ewes and rams have finally been captured. The Kofa mountain population was in good shape and will quickly replace the animals removed. In the Southwest, the most critical limiting element for survival is water. With Pittman-Robertson money, thousands of catchments have been built, benefiting not only the desert bighorn, but mule deer, songbirds, quail, and many more, even insects. This release site on federal public land has been thoroughly surveyed to make certain that sufficient quantities of food, water, and cover are available. Old records show that the desert bighorn had once inhabited these mountains and now will once again. Alaska. Some call it our last frontier. Sparsely populated, filled with spectacular scenery and what seems limitless wildlife. In Alaska today, one can imagine how the early pioneers felt as their wagons rolled westward from St. Louis toward the Rockies. Here, finally, was a place where nature's riches were inexhaustible. Fish-filled streams, forests that stretched to the horizon, and wildlife in great abundance. A place so vast that the thought that man's arrival could have an impact on so much nature in any way was laughable. In Alaska, even more than the lower 48 states, nature's balance is easily tipped. A late spring snowstorm or a sudden increase in predator numbers and a wildlife population can shrink measurably. In Alaska, it can take years to recover. Caribou are a good example. On this day, the Alaska Fish and Game Department caribou biologists will be censusing the Delta herd. It is near the end of June and the caribou have calved. Warm weather has brought out the mosquitoes which plague the caribou, driving them together to escape their tormentors. Now is the best time for the annual count. The beaver, a rugged workhorse of a plane, serves as the camera ship. The smaller scout flies reconnaissance and calls in the beaver to take photos of the larger groups. While the caribou herds on the flat Arctic plain gather in one area by the tens of thousands, the interior herds may remain scattered in small groups over hundreds of square miles. This annual census is critical to caribou management. The caribou's reproductive rate is low and mortality can be very high. As many as 90% of the calves have been lost in one season to predators or unusually cold weather. This year's fall hunting season and bag limits will be based on data from this survey. Alaska employs 5 wildlife research biologists who specialize in caribou. Each is responsible for monitoring specific herds. These annual counts are showing a steady increase over the years in Alaska's caribou populations. The annual census has proved that wildlife managers can significantly increase caribou herds by managing its major predators, wolves and man. In Alaska, wolves are abundant, and the human pressure is increasing. Research has shown that on an average, a wolf will kill 23 caribou a year, and when wolf numbers were cut back, the caribou populations soared. Whether to control the wolf to benefit caribou populations is a puzzle that affects not only caribou harvest, but also the welfare of caribou range and even the health of the wolf pack. For a predator population must have a stable and abundant prey supply. It's a tricky decision. As technology advances, new tools are being developed to aid wildlife researchers. Radio collars now being tested on caribou and polar bear transmit data directly to orbiting satellites, data on an animal's precise location and even its activity, such as resting or feeding. This information is downlinked and stored in a huge computer in France and can be retrieved and displayed here in Fairbanks, Alaska, when needed. On the computer screen are the precise routes taken by 2 caribou during 2 weeks in May. To gather this same information by field observation would be impossible. A different aspect of wildlife conservation and the Pittman-Robertson program are the hunter safety education courses that every state conducts. 700,000 students are trained each year in safe handling of firearms, respect for wildlife, respect for public and private property, and responsible behavior while hunting. Here in New York, the first state with a hunter education program, 10 hours of successful training are mandatory, as they are in most states, before a hunting license can be issued. This class is taught by a volunteer instructor. Nationwide, there are more than 45,000 men and women who contribute their time and energy to teaching hunter education. The states may also use Pittman-Robertson funds for the construction or rental of firing ranges. As a result of its hunter safety programs, New York has cut in half its hunting-related injuries.
Stance for holding a shotgun. Okay, let's put your right foot out just a little bit more and flex your right knee and lean into it a little bit. That's very good. Okay, let's try a live one. Okay, bring the gun up and get in the proper stance. When you're ready, call for the bird. Oh. Excellent.
Finally, after all the hours of instruction and anticipation, there is that first, never-to-be-forgotten hunt. Hunting is a recreation enjoyed by more than 18 million Americans who spend more than $10 billion each year. The sportsman, through license fees and through the self-imposed Pittman-Robertson excise tax, has helped perhaps more than anyone in wildlife's restoration. In a very real way, the sportsman has provided the financial base for the modern science of wildlife management.
Who would like dark meat and who would like the light meat, Preston?
Year after year, generous harvests are taken from America's game populations. And yet, these species are among the most stable and secure, even in the presence of our growing human population. Since 1937 and the enactment of Pittman-Robertson, respect for our land community is slowly increasing, and with it have come profound changes in the status of America's wildlife. Many wildlife species have been restored to much of their former range, and some have dramatically increased their populations. Wildlife management is now established as a science and is taught in many universities and colleges. Through continuing research, we are understanding more about wildlife needs and how to meet them. In every state and territory, there is now an agency responsible for the welfare of wildlife, staffed by trained and dedicated professionals. Pittman-Robertson has enabled the states to buy more than 4 million acres of land for wildlife and to manage another 40 million acres specifically for wildlife habitat. The majority of people that use these lands, 3/4 in fact, are not hunters, but hikers, bird watchers, and others who enjoy seeing wildlife in its natural environment. Many American wildlife species are in better condition today than at any time during the past 100 years, a direct result of public and private interests working toward a common goal, the restoration of wildlife. We have come far since 1937, and there's so much more to be done. But we can pause for a moment and celebrate America's wildlife.
I like to know that big black bears still roam the forest floor. I like to know wild turkeys strut and gobble as before. That racing graceful antelope still run the grassy range, and dancing prairie chicken boom and stamp across the plain. I'd like to visit meadows with herds of bugling elk. I'd like to stand with bighorn sheep upon their rocky shelf, to see the wood duck settle down, see beaver and much more. I'm so proud of what we've done, America's wildlife to restore. I want to teach my children how the natural world abounds, with cooing, gobbling, booming, let them hear the many sounds. Somehow I've got to teach them that the music of the wild still echoes in the scheme of life for woman, man, and child. I like to think of wildlife as time goes racing by, when days fly off like leaves are tossed and blown against the sky. The deep and secret rhythm of creatures who abide in the forest, river, desert, cross this continent so wide. Yes, the deep and secret rhythm of the wildlife that still roam in mountains, valleys, meadows, cross America.